to give a very brief, before going into the costumes, I just want to give a very brief, I just want to not go into the costumes and talk about why that television series is actually one of the most faithful adaptations, at least filmed adaptations, whether it be a television film, a television series, or a cinematographic film, or even a cinematographic series of films, such as the Basil Rathbone one from back in the 40s. Why that one is one of the three most faithful ones. Obviously, people will say that is the most faithful. I disagree. The characterization of Sherlock Holmes made by the brilliant actor Jeremy Brett is by far the most faithful. So first of all, I want to say one thing, as somebody has said on Kroger. It is impossible because of how the original book Sherlock Holmes is not very precisely described. It is basically impossible to make one version of Sherlock Holmes which everybody would agree on. I mean, which would fit for 100% sure. I mean, it is possible but the way he made it is one of maybe 10 interpretations that we could have on that character, or maybe 5 interpretations, and it is spot on right. And he does the same characterization throughout all 43 episodes he made, or 42 or 41 or whatever. And it is by far the most accurate. And this actor brings literally, I want to say one of the best, because there are other actors, a few of them who are as good as him, including Klaus Kinski and whatever. But I think it is not possible to be a better actor than Jeremy Brett. And what he did was literally by far the most faithful. But if one looks at the entire production, whether it be the entire movie or film, when I mean movie, I mean a cinematographic film, but it doesn't really matter, or television series, or even a cartoon, or even a comic. I will only talk about animated things, so including, I don't know cartoons, forget cartoons, but with real actors, live action. It depends. Some episodes are bloody faithful, but for some things, I think that television series, the other Sir Arthur Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes from 1968, was actually more faithful, including how the Baker Street was presented. I mean, the 221B apartment. And as for some things, that awful movie with Robert Downey Jr., which is absolutely unfaithful, was actually the only faithful ones in terms of Holmes' fighting skills. In fact, in the books, he is even stronger than Robert Downey Jr.'s Sherlock Holmes, because he has a superhuman strength. And if you do not believe me, check out the video I will put somewhere recommended. He is described as inhumanly strong. He can literally bend steel portals. So he basically has Captain America's strength in the book. In the book, Sherlock Holmes is not very realistic, actually, unlike what people think. It is less realistic than what they're trying to picture him as in the movies. And even Robert Downey Jr. was not a superhumanly strong there, but he was the closest I saw, at least, that came to that definition. So in terms of the strength displayed, he was the closest. In terms of the looks, he was one of the most far away. But now, I will just make a brief definition. Out of all the films, they started making adaptations in 1901. Initially, when they were making adaptations, because it was a silent film era, they could not really make it faithful, at least not the ones I watched, because the silent films have to have action in them. Because a lot of the books are actually based on talking. It is not really possible. In a silent film, it is possible, but it would be incredibly boring. So instead it became almost a sort of slapstick comedy / James Bond Sherlock Holmes, whereby a lot of action is happening, and so it is not very faithful at all. Then one enters into the, with Sherlock Holmes, I forgot which one, and I think Clive Brook made the first, 1933 or 32, the first talking Sherlock Holmes, but it was even less faithful than a lot of the silent ones. And then because also, what one has to know is that because Sherlock Holmes is set in the books, his cases are set, the cases themselves, not the flowbacks, which may be even further back, but the cases are set from 1878 to 1914 in the books. Now the style is were written into 1927. Forget all this is fiction. But they were set into 1914. In the original canon is written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, not the continuation made by his son. I've not come that in, and I have not even read those. I'm really a purely canon fiction addict, like the original canon. So, because the first films started being made in the same era that the last stories are being set, they did not bother setting it prior, if that makes sense. But the problem began in the 1920s, 30s, including the first talking Sherlock Holmes, when they set it in the time period these movies were made. And that is a big problem because, to be honest, life from 1920 compared to life in 1900, although it is the same gap than life in 2000 compared to life in today, 2023, there were many more differences, many more changes that occurred, whether technological or changes of mores in terms of how people behaved and the clothing even, especially for the women. And so by the time of 1932, the first talking Sherlock Holmes is set in 1932, it is completely inaccurate compared to the books because life has utterly changed and people dress differently, especially women. With men, it sort of passes to some degrees. And technology was completely different. They had cars, and in order to have cars during the late 19th century, they were very luxury and to look like horseless carriages, like they were basically like a carriage with a motor car, like with an engine and without a horse. Whereas by the 1930s, they looked way more like actual cars, and that just takes completely like it changes the entire picture of the stories. Even had they respected the stories of the book, which they had not, and they could not possibly have, because for example it says, oh, Mr. Whatever lighted a candle to see what burglar was in his house. But then in 1930, let us say Mr. Whatever Mr. X is a lord. A lord living in London would have had electricity. You know, except if he was like super old-fashioned and 90 years old and did not want to adapt to the modern life, which he would not be. So it is not really possible to make it faithful when it is set 30 years later, especially in that context whereby life changed much faster than today, whereby only phones, like I use this for this, so I look old-fashioned, but apart from phones, practically nothing changes in now 50 years or even more. So there's minute changes, but back then there were big changes occurring all the time. So in 10 years, life looked different. So by 1939, the first movie set in the Victorian era occurs, called The Hand of the Baskerville with Bass and Rathbone. But apart from the time it was set in, and had huge historical mistakes, especially in terms of the clothing and all, and then came out the second movie, and these two movies were the first two that were actually set in the correct time period, because they were set in 1889 and then 1891, and the first one, Hand of the Baskervilles, was set in 1889, and then with Moriarty, I think it was set in the 91, and that is when the final problem, or the story to base it on, was set. So it was much better for that. But back then, one has to understand is, in movies, as I explained, the Gangs of New York videos, costumes were not seen, they were like theater movies back then, they were seen as theater. They were not seen as realistic representations of what goes on in the real world. And that is why, if one watches the film, for example, watch a Sherlock Holmes, the first talking one, it looks much less realistic than the 1960s one, whereby they are all sort of posing and they sort of look like Hollywood movies then. For example, Watson will be saying, Holmes, surely, and it seems very theatrical almost. And step by step with talking films, that sort of waned away, but for the costumes it remained a long time, whereby people did not want to see reality represented for that reason, that films were not meant to represent reality, and on top of that, as Bernard Banner explains, the Joe average did not have internet and even had a less educative approach to life than he had in the 1960s or 80s, and so people might be easily fooled as long as it looked more or less like the time period. And it was not even meant to represent the actual time period, and even if people might have believed it because they could not just go on the internet, and a lot of people did not even know how to read then, or were badly educated, so they would never have bothered themselves to go to a library to consult the few historical menswear books available at that time, and hoping they were more or less accurate, which they were probably not. because all the studies made by people like me were not done yet. They had not been interested in that subject.